Okay, everybody, it's Kevin Lockett once again. Today we're talking to known author David Ritz. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm fine. I'm happy to be here. Happy to start talking to you, with you, at you.
Today we're going to talk about your latest book with the artist Kim. But before we get into that, we had a slight conversation about Akron, Ohio, and we started discussing Hewett and James Ingram.
Yeah, and it just occurred to me the name of the band. James, before he came to LA and he worked in the Ray Charles studio, which is where I met him in 1977. Because my first book was the autobiography of Ray Charles. James was in a band in Akron called Revelation Funk, and he was the organ player. He didn't even sing, and he really didn't discover his voice until he came out here. So, and then Howard Hewett, of course, comes from Akron. He's a pal of mine, and we've written together, and he's brilliant, as James was brilliant. And so Akron is an important spot in history of American music.
What did you do with Howard Hewett?
Howard and I wrote a song. I think we wrote a couple of songs on one of the albums. He's just been a really close friend of mine. I met him through Quincy Jones. He was always doing background for Quincy. I met him with Steve when he was still in Shalimar. I was among those who was very excited when he went out on his own. You know, I just think he's an incredibly precise and soulful, and you know, his perfect pitch. Just a great singer and a great guy. So
yeah, I think Akron kind of gets lost in the history when it comes to music, because we've had a lot of talented, you know, Howard Hewett, James Ingram, Debo. We've had a lot of, you know, everybody loves LeBron, so it's great for LeBron puts a spotlight on Akron, but we also have a rich music history as well. So today we're talking about your latest book. It is with the artist Kim. So explain to me how you and Kim got together to put together this book.
Well, Chemistry came out, and I was crazy about it. It came out 20 years ago, and I think we met. I think he wanted to do a book then, and that was 20 years ago, because he had such an extraordinary story. And I remember having lunch with him and thinking, well, it may be a little bit early, and so we kept in touch and went back and forth, and finally, maybe 4 years ago, this is 16 years after we met, and I would go to his shows and, you know, enjoy him, and I would, you know, Chemistry 2 came out, and Intimacy and all the albums came out, and I thought he, as an artist, he continued to improve and evolve. But it wasn't until 4 years ago that we really sat down and made up our minds that it was time to do a book. But the thing about Ken that's different than most books I do, most books, well, I don't know if it's most books, because there isn't really any exact pattern, but often what will happen, I'll get a contract for a book, and I will meet with the person for 2 or 3 or 4 months, and then sit down and write the book for 4 or 5 months, and it'll take a year and a half. In Kim's case, and you can hear it in his music, there's a lot of silences between the notes. There's a lot of introspection and reflection and thoughtfulness. And so lots of times, now the pandemic happened. In the middle of our working, but you would think that somehow the pandemic would help speed things up, because he wasn't touring and we could talk more and we get the book done. But and though we did talk during the pandemic, and though we continued to work on the book, his reflection was so deep that sometimes, you know, 2 months would pass before he would call me and we would start talking again. And so the idea that the book took 4 years is really a reflection of his reflectiveness, if that's a word. I think it is a word. Anyway,
Yeah.
and so he's a very thoughtful person. He's meticulous. He's careful. And he's got his own pace. And then, of course, it involved speaking to other people.
Right.
Like his mom is a major character. So I had to, I had the pleasure of, meeting her and developing a relationship with her, and hopefully winning her trust. And her story is very deep and very relevant. Obviously, a mother's story is relevant to a son's stories, but they were both alcoholics, so that was extraordinary. And then she was in rehab, and that influenced him. And so the introduction of her story as a major subtext to the book became important, and that added to the amount of time it took. So, but it turned out great, and it takes as long as it takes, and I love him, and I love talking to him, and I love working with him, and but he's shy. And the paradox in doing the book was he was very motivated to tell everything, because he knew he had this important story to tell about addiction and homelessness and family dysfunction and everything else. But by nature, he's shy. And so the contradiction was a shy man wanted to reveal everything. And part of him didn't want to reveal it, and part of him did want to reveal it. But the part of him that did want to reveal it was more powerful than the part of him that did not want to reveal it. But that didn't mean that the part of him that did not want to reveal it didn't come into play and cause some pause. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. So it's kind of like you meet a person who's shy and really doesn't want to talk to you, but really does want to talk to you. And so you had that kind of tension.
There's a line out of the book, I want to get this correct, that I think Kim said his memoir is a tale soaked in blues.
Yeah.
And that's very telling, because if you unwind his story, it does feel like a blues album. It's very aspirational. Yeah. Once we get at the end, or in the middle at the end, of course, but it does feel like a blues album, even though he's not a blues artist.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I think he's a blues man. I think that, I think you can be a blues man and not be a blues artist. So I do think rhythm and blues is pretty soaked in the blues. It's just a different, as his hip hop, as his jazz, as his gospel, as it's all blended together. But I think the blues is basically the form, the American form. But it's soaked in the blues, I think, because the origin story is so near tragic. He almost did himself in before he got started, and so as a teenager and as a high school kid, and as a kid in his teen and young 20s, he was wild. But again, when I say he's wild, his wildness didn't take the form of going out and hitting people over the head. It took the form of self-destruction from within. He was tearing himself up, not just with drugs, which he was, and crack and everything else, but he was tearing himself up from an emotional point of view. He had absolutely no sense of who he was, no sense of worth, no sense of purpose. He saw no future. It was bleak. And at a time in our lives when we're 18, 19, 20, 17, we should be, but you're high carefree in high school, and the world is you know, you got everything to look forward to. He was about to check out. And so that's why I think he used that phrase, soaked in the blues. But it's interesting that you used the word aspirational, because that's what makes the story to me so intriguing, that you go from this near tragic act one, where you have a teenage boy and a kid in his young 20s without hope, inarticulate, shy, strung out, you know, living in empty lots, you know, homeless. And suddenly he gets I'm sober. And of course, the 12-step thing is everything. It becomes his church. And there are other churches he joins, but I think his essential church is the Church of the 12 Steps, which is really the church of a higher power that can heal you. And once he gets into that church, and once he becomes a 12-stepper, and once he gains sobriety at a young age, because if everything's happening young for him, you know, by the time he's 23, on his 23rd birthday, he becomes sober. Then you have this extraordinary drive kicking in. And so you have these two disparate elements. One is, what can I do to do myself in, you know, while I'm getting high and while I'm being crazy, blah, blah, blah. And then the other is, what can I do to get myself out there and make my mark and establish myself as an artist? And then, of course, once he does, it becomes important for him to tell his story. So it's important to remember that this book is here, and I'm grateful it's here, and I'm honored to be part of it. But he's been telling the story for a while. If you've gone to Chem concerts, there's always a kind of a testimony. He gives his testimony and has been doing that forever. Right. So he's always been eager to do that. But anyway, getting back to what you were talking about, it is an interesting contrast between a person with absolutely no aspirational energy, and then suddenly, once he gains his footing, and it takes him a while, you know, works as a waiter, and he does all kinds of odd jobs, and until he gets his thinking chops together, and he realizes that he can perform, and that he is an artist, and he has something to say, and that he will take on the industry in this kind of bootstrap way, which I don't know if you can do it anymore. I mean, this is all pre-YouTube, and this is selling CDs out of a trunk and going to mom and papa stores, and you know, really, I mean, the nitty gritty of it all. So that to me is what makes it so interesting, that the energy completely changes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't think about that question before, but he's probably the last of that era, pre-MySpace, where you had to do it on your own, that you had to get in the car and drive around and sell a CD. So what, you know, because MySpace, I think, started around 2005. So he was like the last part of that era. Yeah.
And that's why, again, I love telling the story, because my being old, and I like to kind of document eras that are gone. I mean, people forget now because it's all, you hit a couple of buttons and there it is, as opposed to jumping in your car and trying to find the address of the mom and papa store in Akron, Ohio, or wherever you happen to be, and going to the store owner and playing them a track and hoping they'll take 30 or 40 CDs or 10 CDs, and hoping they'll call you back, and then playing little gigs and little venues and word of mouth. And so I like the anachronistic nature of that story, you know, that ain't going to happen again.
No, it's interesting with his music, because when you go to a Kim Carson concert or just listen to his music, it's very soothing. You almost sit there almost meditating. You know, whatever problems you have when you leave anything, you listen to his music, you feel better. It's like, okay, like I'm, you know, whatever's going on with me, I'm more relaxed. Which is fascinating to me because given his background, which is very traumatic, it's hard to believe that it's almost like a Zen feeling, a serene feeling that he's producing this type of music when before, like everything was so chaotic when he was growing up until like you said, around 20 something years old or so.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's part of what's intriguing to me as well, man, because I think that's what got me before I met him. That I mean, I couldn't stop listening to Chemistry, and I used it as a meditative resource. You know, I mean, I would sit and listen to it and chill. Again, paradox is paradox is paradox. You know, chaotic, dysfunctional, upbringing with a lot of unspoken rage and anger. Why does that lead to an artist who is meditative and helps you chill and everything? I don't know. I mean, it's a paradox. And I think the paradoxes have to remain I mean, I could break it down. I could try to break it down. But I think the thing about mysteries is we love them because they can't. I mean, a true mystery, if it's resolved, is no longer a mystery. So I prefer to embrace the mystery and kind of say, isn't it interesting that this cat who was so dysfunctional and so scattered in his thoughts became a conduit to music that will ease your mind. I think, talking about the music a little bit more specifically, I also think he hit a sweet spot between smooth jazz, R&B, and jazz. In other words, it's not smooth jazz. I mean, it's definitely, he's an R&B artist. He's a jazz artist. He's informed by jazz. And again, the genres all merge at a certain point. But I think he's a different R&B artist. I mean, and again, the only person you can really point to is Al Jarreau, because there's and people would talk about that the timbre of his voice is a little reminiscent of Al. And of course, Al did do pop and jazz, and Al was a great jazz singer, but he also had R&B hits. So there is some analogy there, but I wouldn't take it that far. I mean, we can trace anybody back to anybody because we're all the products of artists who have influenced us. But I think Kim is pretty unique in that regard, that when Chemistry hit, it did have what you're talking about. I mean, you think of Maze and Frankie Beverly as kind of the family picnic music and the celebratory brotherhood of, you know, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, of course, I love him. But it's different, man. He's not Frankie Beverly. You know, he's not Marvin Gaye. He's not Stevie, or, I mean, he really is the product of a very unusual upbringing. And I think what he brings to the music is a transformational, I guess that's the word I've been trying to find. It's what you were talking about, Kevin, is that you go to the concert and you find yourself transformed. You go there agitated and you leave relaxed. And there are very few transformational artists who are able to dig that deeply into your heart and your soul and give you the feeling that it's all right.
Right. Speaking of transformational artists, you helped co-write Sexual Healing with Marvin Gaye. Yeah. And Marvin, even though vocally they're different, musically they're different, but both Kim and Marvin Gaye both had addiction issues and family issues, even though they were different. Did you find any thread when you were working on the book with Kim, any thread between them like that?
Yeah, positively. And what's so interesting about that, and it's, you know, we can talk about it forever, but we won't. talk about forever, talk about for 5 minutes. Cam is an instance where both his mother's intelligence and his intelligence led him to understand the importance of mental health. Mm-hmm. So he dealt with his mental health early on in his life. As have a lot of people. You go to counselors, you go to 12. I mean, there's a lot of modalities, and I'm not advocating one modality. There's church. But you are able to specifically define mental health as a problem. Mm-hmm. Marvin Gaye never did that in his life. He never did it. I and 25 other people, including Dick Gregory, could never get him to a counselor, could never get him. And so there was a deterioration. First of all, he never got clean. He never got sober. But even on top of that, he never reached out. And Ken has been the opposite. I mean, he's a person who really values mental health. And he talks in the book about going to a psychiatrist and getting psychotropic meds at a certain point in his life when he was hit hard by depression. And so, he's like a mature adult who understood that the pressures, and what's interesting to me, one of the most interesting moments of the book, which took me by surprise, was when he gets his Motown contract, mm-hmm. and he almost has a nervous breakdown. He cannot sign the contract. It's like everything he's been working for. He's been selling these CDs on his own, and suddenly Motown hears about it, and he auditions for him in New York, and they offer him a contract. And he's Detroit, and of course, Motown is Motor Town, and it's Detroit, at least in its origins, and everything. It's a huge international company owned by Universal, and he takes him forever to sign the contract because he's scared of giving up control. And so he has to deal with that issue. He goes to a counselor. He talks about it. So I think that one of the reasons he's so strong and he's endured for these last couple of decades, so that he's been able to thrive, is that he does not ignore the issue of mental health, and consequently has become a lot stronger as a person. And man, I don't know how many books I've done at this time, but a whole bunch. But very few artists that I have worked with have stopped and said, oh, I think I better go to a counselor, or I better go to a psychologist, or I better go to a psychiatrist and do some work on myself here because show business is fucking me up. And I mean, it's now, I think hopefully it's happening more and more now. I hope. I don't know that for sure. But the book, if the book is in addition to hopefully in addition to bringing people pleasure when they read it, because I hope that, it's got a groove and it reads well and people enjoy reading it. But I think there's also things to learn in the book, which is, when you feel yourself going crazy, you do something about it. You go to a pro, and so that I think was of great comfort to me. And because doing Marvin's book was such a, it just broke my heart because I loved him so much, and to die at that age and look at the work that he had done before he died, imagine the work he would have done afterwards, and all that kind of stuff. So it was great to meet a brother who was so keen on asking for help when he knew that he needed help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad the mental health thing is a big subject in the book, because personally for myself, full disclosure, I've always dealt with mild depression and anxiety. So when you're telling the story about the Motown contract and he kind of freaked out a bit, I've been there too, where great things were coming my way, and it's like, I get very claustrophobic. But again, but I would tell people, hey, I tell people all the time, people should have a therapist and a really good stylist, because people sometimes don't know how to dress, but we all got some things buzzing around our heads that we all need help.
Well, and also, not to kind of
no, go ahead.
Milk this to death, but one of the other things that I think Kim was so interesting about his story was what happens with artists is that when they make it, there's a feeling of entitlement because they work so hard to make it. It's so hard to make it. So once they do, then they're touring 200 nights or 300 or whatever, and they're recording and they're they feel entitled. And entitlement is pushes against asking for help. Mm-hmm. I'm entitled to indulge myself. I'm entitled to whatever it is, get high or jump in the pool of anarchy of one kind, or a carnal anarchy, or whatever it is. And I think that now here's another important thing about the story. He gets sober on his 23rd birthday. But it takes him another decade or so for him to get himself together and get that deal. So by the time he does that album, he's in his the 30s. So it's not like his first album hits, he ain't Tevin Campbell or Michael Jackson. Right. So, he ain't a child star. He's kind of a mature man when Chemistry comes out. And I think that helps him enormously avoid the craziness of show business. Right. And I think I've never gotten the idea that Kim struggles with entitlement, that and also arrogance. He isn't arrogant. I mean, and even though his talent is abundant and his talent is kind of natural in a certain way. I mean, he's like a natural born singer. He's a natural born writer and poet. I mean, he really works hard at it. And I think he's a great I mean, for example, most of the time when I write my books, and the people that I work with don't go over it like, line by line. He did. He was a great editor. And so he treated the book like a song. Lenny Kravitz did that too, by the way. He was another guy that I worked with just before Kim, who was a really, really good editor. But that's unusual. Most artists, you give them the book, they read it, they make the changes. They said, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, but they don't sit down for days or weeks or even months and edit the book with you. I mean, he did. Right. So he's a patient man, and I think that requires. I mean, I kind of want to use all these words about Kim, like maturity. He's mature. Artists tend to be childish. Artists tend to be indulgent. Artists tend to be. Sometimes they don't ever grow up. Because they've been spoiled by the business and all that kind of stuff. But you know, you work with Cam, you're really working with a guy who's, you know, highly mature.
Right. His mom plays a big part of his life, and I'm sure a major part in the book. As a writer, how do you get the trust of somebody? Because it's one thing for Kim to say, hey, David, let's work on this book together. But it's another thing to talk to someone and they have to reveal some things that maybe most people don't know about them or they've kept to themselves. As a writer, and it's also for aspiring writers, how do you get the trust of someone who's needed for your book or whatever you're writing when they're not really the main subject of your piece?
Well, I have to say that there isn't any easy answer, but over the years, what I've learned is to express my love of the project. Well, but like, first of all, the first thing I told Kim's mom was, listen, I love Kim. I love your son. I love his story. And I appreciate your speaking to me. So I try to come from a place of gratitude and love. I know that sounds corny, but I think if you come as the cold journalist, okay, I'm here to ask you certain questions. 1 through 10 is, when did you become an alcoholic? When, you know, blah, blah, blah. It ain't going to work. I mean, in other words, if you come with and I'm telling the truth. I mean, when I tell her I love your son, I do love Kim and I do love his music. And I am honored to be able to help him tell a story. So it's not jive. I mean, and it's not a pitch. I try not to be ashamed of expressing how I really feel. And even though sometimes it sounds corny and sometimes people are embarrassed by their true feelings, I think the more we express our true feelings, the more responsive the people are. And then you get them to open up their heart because you've opened up your heart. Another, I wouldn't say device because that sounds too
calculating.
Yeah, too manipulative. But another thing I do is when I sense that my interviewee is reluctant to speak about intimate things that I want to hear about, I'll speak about my own life and my own relationship to my mother. And I say, I know this is tough to be a mother and a son, because I remember the time my mother, you know, caught me getting high and it was blah, 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 blah. So in other words, if I come to them, I try to serve myself up as an example of how I want them to speak. I try to be a living example of how I would like them to respond to me. And if the more vulnerable, so it all comes down to, you know, be vulnerable, be emotionally forthcoming, be loving, be patient, be kind, be aware of the fact that the first interview may not happen. In other words, I think even in the case of Kane's mom, who's also very shy and also doesn't, you know, isn't that forthcoming in the beginning. I think our early interviews were fairly short because I realized I needed more time and she needed more time. But then once we got going, I mean, it was great. She was incredible. And she's, you know, like him, you know, highly intelligent and deeply introspective, and became his sort of role model in a certain way of what it meant to get into rehab and to stay in rehab and to, you know, hook up with a higher power in an unorthodox way, because the church they went to was not a typical church. It was kind of a new agey church. So the answer to your question is be loving. I know that sounds, I don't think you're going to read it in a textbook, but it certainly worked for me. You know, And also you would be surprised how many artists. I mean, I remember when I first met Ray Charles was the first time I had to convince an artist to let me write his life story. This is 47, 48 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just telling him, man, you kill me, man. I can't believe, you know, I just love the way you sing. It makes me crazy. You know, I mean, I was just forthcoming, and he liked hearing. I mean, who doesn't like hearing that? And it was the truth. You know, I felt like I was working with, you know, Mozart or somebody, you know. So that I think it's this whole music thing, Kevin, is very emotional. And soul music, which is, you know, what we love so much in its various forms, means exposing your soul, you know. And so if you're going to do a book about soul music, you better be a soulful writer. You better expose your soul as you go. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So what keeps you motivated? Because like you said, your first book was with Ray Charles. And in recent years, you worked with Kim and Kevin Garnett and like Lenny Kravitz and Janet Jackson, all these people. Yeah. But what keeps you motivated? Because you've been doing this for a long time. I mean, your subjects are interesting, so that should be part of it. But still, something has to first still burn inside of you.
I don't know. I mean, I guess that's where Kim and I related to a large degree. We're both very aspirational. You know, I grew up, you know, lower middle class. And so, first of all, I like to make money and I like to get paid for writing books. And I still like making money. And that's always been a motivation to me. I've always wanted to be a commercial writer and not have to have a teaching job to supplement my writing, because I wanted to write. So money is certainly an aspect of it. And I love getting contracts and getting paid. But I also am curious. I mean, I think I'm mainly driven by curiosity. And there's so many artists that I love that I want to know about. And so that I just, you know, I've written some books with Willie Nelson recently, his autobiography, and some other books about his life. And, you know, that was a whole new world to me of growing up in rural Texas and during the Depression, and his country music influences and his jazz. You know, I mean, so it's kind of like, this is a weird thing. I was telling this to a pal the other day. At my age, and like I said, I'm almost 80. It's like I'm equally amazed at how much I know, because I know a lot of stuff, but I'm just as amazed at how much I don't know. Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know a whole lot of stuff, and so that new books, and then the other thing which is different from me from other writers, that I'm mainly a ghost writer, and being a ghost writer puts you in another category, because I'm not looking to write my story and put out my point of view. It isn't like, what I'm looking to is help other people tell their stories who may not have the chops to write a 400-page book. And so ghostwriting is I didn't learn it in college. I don't think they have any course. I mean, maybe they have a course on it. Not
probably now they do, but you know, like when you were going to school, they probably did not.
Yeah, no, I never took any courses on creative writing or anything. So being a ghostwriter is different than being a biographer. People who are writing biographies of Miles Davis and Janet, you know, a friend of mine is wrote a biography of Janis Joplin of Janis Joplin a couple of years ago, and she's writing a biography of Jack Kerouac, and you know, these people are dead and she didn't know them, but she's doing incredible research and writing great books about them. I want to catch them when they're still alive. You know, I want to hang out with Aretha Franklin. I want to hang out with Ray Charles. I want to hang out with, you know, B.B. King and Buddy Guy and Etta James and the Neville Brothers. I want to hang out with these people. And even beyond being curious about their stories, I want to hang out with them because I like hanging out with them. You know, it's fun. I want to have a good time. So I think what keeps me going is I'm having a good time. I'm having fun. And even though writing a book, there's always a grind. I mean, we're all on the grind. But if you can find the groove in the grind, in other words, if the grind has a rhythm to it, and if there is a groove that is good to you and feels good to you, then you can get through the grind, and then the grind has a certain kind of pleasure to it. So I'm always looking for the groove in the grind, and because I'm so groove oriented, you know, began by talking about James Ingram's funk band in Akron, Revelation Funk. I mean, I've always, ever since I was a little kid, I've been moved by grooves. Mm-hmm. You know, Ray and Bo Diddley and Little Richard and on and on and on, and Jam and Lewis and Coltrane and Count AC and Earth, Wind and Fire and so on and so forth. So I've always loved grooves, and in my books I try to establish a groove, which I learned from music, not from other books. I try to make my books musical. So that's the other thing that keeps me going, is I feel like I'm making music. Even though it's literature, my main motto is always music. I love music far more than I love literature. Mm-hmm. I listen to music far more than I read. I enjoy music far more than any other art form. And so it's a pleasure, and as long as I am, and I think the other thing, like I say, the other thing that keeps me going is like you and I are now talking for whatever we've talked for, you know, an hour or so forth. You know, I'm curious about you. You know, when we began, you told me you had a podcast early on, blah blah blah. So I mean, here you are, Kevin. Who are you, and how did you get where you were? And so we could talk another 2 hours, and I could ask you a whole bunch of more questions, and who's mommy and who's daddy, and are you an only child, and on and on and on. So I'm curious about human beings. I just think it's interesting how we all get to where we are, and who are we, and what can you kind of teach me? I mean, what have you learned that I don't know? Because your trip is a whole lot. Your trip is a whole lot different than my trip. So you know, I'm going to be doing this until I just can't do it anymore, you know.
If I have a suggestion for a book, is a book on Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. I've always loved those guys, and I don't think there's ever been a definitive book. They really don't write too many books about producers, but those guys, I just love those guys so much. And the best thing about those guys is they never had a contract, and their whole business partnership was a handshake.
No, and we've been talking, and I don't know if it'll happen, but we've been talking, and I love Jimmy and Terry, and they're humorous and funny and brilliant, and I love the whole. You know, I did a Morris day book, and I got some time with Morris in Minneapolis, and he comes out of that culture, and I think the Minneapolis funk thing is brilliant, and those guys are great characters, and they're astounding. So I completely agree with you, and I appreciate the encouraging words about them.
Right. So why should let's go back to Kim for a second. So if people are curious, I'm sure his fans will pick up the book. For people who kind of know Kim or kind of know his music, why should they pick up the Share My Life book?
Well, because I think they'll learn. I mean, I think there are life lessons to learn in the book. And beyond that, I think there is, I think this sounds, well, it can't be too arrogant because he's the co-author, so I'll give him but I think there is great pleasure in reading the book. I think the book reads a lot like a Kim album. And so I think there is enjoyment there, but I also think it's unique. And like I said, I don't know of another story like his that I've encountered. And like I said, I've written 60-something books at this point, and this stands on its own as a unique story. And also, I think it's a feel-good book, and that's got a happy ending. You know, he's happily married. He struggled with a lot of relationships with women. He's struggled with the phenomena of interracial relationships. He's real honest about that. He's had his heart broken. He's broken hearts, but, you know, he's happily married now, and he's found domestic happiness. And, you know, one thing I learned, one thing that, you know, Marvin Gaye told me, I don't know, this is back when we met, 1979 or something. And we, you know, he liked to talk. And I asked him, Marvin, what is it that you want? And his answer killed me. It was 3 words: simple, domestic happiness. He never got it. I think Kim has that to a large degree. And I think domestic happiness, where you're in the crib, you're in with the one you love, you have an established home life, is a big deal. And so that, you know, it's a book with one of the most difficult beginnings imaginable, and a very heartwarming conclusion.
One more question, because you mentioned Willie Nelson before, and he just got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And if you talked to him a bunch of times, what do you think is his main influence on music? Because this is like Willie's going to be around forever. Yeah. But well, what is his main?
I think Willie is in the Louis Armstrong, Ray Charles, Judy Garland category, in that well, first of all, he's a great composer, which is different than those people. But he's a great interpreter of song, and he's incredibly idiosyncratic interpreter of song, and he's enormously brave about what songs he will interpret. So he has sung everything from the Great American Songbook, Stardust, to all the great country hits of all time, and I think he has one of the archetypal American voices, a voice that is stark and very sincere, which is very close to the heart, unadorned, unpretentious, and like I said, like Louis Armstrong or like Ray Charles, he's a major American voice to whom people can relate.
All right, that's a good way to end the conversation.
Well, Kevin, David, man.
Well, David Ritz, thank you. People want to check you out. Where can they go?
It's just ritzwrites.com.
All right.
RITZWRIT. There it is.
There it is, ritzwrites.com.